In the summer of 1964, you were working for the London newspaper, the Daily Express.
Correct.
And one day you got the assignment to join the Beatles for 34 days on their cross-country tour here of the U.S. And considering you were a young man at the time, this must have seemed like a dream come true.
Well, it was kind of, I didn't know what to expect. I got a call 6 o'clock in the morning from my foreign editor. He said, the Beatles have just landed in San Francisco. Get on a plane. You're on the tour with them. We want you to cover it from beginning to end. And also, we signed George Harrison to write a column. However, George is a musician, and you will have to write it for him. And I just said, well, sounds good to me. I'd seen the Beatles on the Edmund Show, but that was about it. And so off I went, and what a ride it was.
Since you wound up spending so much time with the Beatles, what was your impression of their individual personalities?
Well, first of all, you've got to remember that back in '64, they were sort of half-formed human beings. They weren't quite the Beatles that most of us know. So they were young kids, and they were absolutely enjoying themselves, life in the candy store. John was kind of wicked and funny and offbeat, and came up with the funniest quips that anyone could ever imagine. And he just was a wild one. Paul was kind of Mr. Smooth. He was a bit of a schmoozer. You know, he sort of went around and he said, "Hi, Ivor, how you doing?" and really knew how to cope with the media. George, who was the guy that I was supposed to get up close and personal with, was a little bit surly because it was new to him, and he didn't have much to say, and I had a hard time with it to start off with. And then there was Ringo, and Ringo was the new boy on the block, really. He'd replaced Pete Best, the drummer.
Right.
And all I can say is that Ringo was the drummer, and the drummers really didn't have much to say. They just banged the drums.
I'd like to ask you about the column that you wrote for George Harrison in his name, and what was the title of that column? Well,
the column was basically, George Harrison reporting. And to be honest with you, for the first couple of columns, George was never awake in time to tell me what happened. I mean, we'd finish a concert maybe about 9, 10 o'clock. The Beatles, we'd all go back to their suites. I mean, we drank. They had breakfast at 2 in the morning.
Right.
And then we'd sometimes play Monopoly or poker. And then they go to bed at 4 or 5, and they didn't wake up until 2 in the afternoon for the press conference. So somewhere along the way, I had to talk to George, but I couldn't because he was asleep. So I made up the first couple of columns. And after the first couple of columns, George confronted me and said, Ivor, that's a load of old rubbish. He used a stronger word than that. And I said, yeah, it is, but if you ever woke up or you ever told me what actually happened to you or gave me some input, it would improve. And then after that, we got along a lot better, and the columns improved, and he did talk to me, but we got off to a bad start.
Considering the mania surrounding the group, were there any times where you feared for your life?
Well, I didn't know what to expect, but as soon as I got there, it became a kind of a frenzy. I mean, I didn't realize that a life and limb was at risk. They were in the first limousine. I was in the second limousine. We had police escorts. It felt like we were royalty or presidential, racing through city streets at breakneck speed with motorcyclists. And then when we got to the stadium, it was even more crazy because there was thousands of young women screaming from start to finish. And then when we finished the concert, and would you believe a Beatle concert back in '64 lasted all of about 27 and a half minutes, and they were gone.
Right.
You didn't get your money's worth, and they couldn't get away with that today, could they?
No, not at all.
But, they did it. They did 10 songs, and they all kind of kidded that they could break their record, do it in 27 minutes and 10 seconds. And they were gone, and we were gone. And as soon as they played Long Tall Sally, we knew we better leave our seat in the front row, race to the second limo, jump in the second limo. Now, what often happened was that because of the madness and because of the danger, they made a getaway in an ambulance or a meat truck.
Right.
And we were stuck in the limo. And one day, I must tell you that I was scared for my life because a bunch of young women jumped on it like the kind of fiends in a horror movie and started hammering on the roof. And I actually was scared.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like Night of the Living Dead.
Exactly,
you know?
the zombies.
Yeah, exactly.
The zombies.
You know, that's an interesting thing to bring up because any young man on the outside looking at this would think, what an incredible life. I mean, women throwing themselves at you, but you have to keep in mind that the Beatles were in their 20s, and what they had surrounding them and screaming at them and chasing them was an army of 12-year-olds.
It was, and, I spoke to a 12-year-old girl last year who's now a little bit older,
right.
And she said to me, and she said to me, I was in love with Ringo, and my friend was in love with George. And we looked at them, they were about 20,000 people in the stadium, and then I saw George smiled at me, and Ringo smiled at her. And, these young women were, fantasizing that the Beatles were in love with them individually, and that was part of the frenzy. And it's hard to imagine, but that was the way it played out then. These young women, screaming nonstop from start to finish, felt that the man in their life was one of the Beatles.
Paul McCartney, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you, sir. Fine, thank you. Thank you very much. Fine, thank you, sir.
Excellent, thank you. We had a question come up to me yesterday from a mother in the crowd. And lately I've seen some dramatic examples of young ladies with fantastic compassion and admiration for one of the Beatles specifically. And some of them feel that they have some messages from up above, or this feeling that they're married to a Beatle spiritually. What do you think about this?
It's funny, isn't it? It's a bit weird. Because none of us think like that. None of us think in...
Well, John answered this way. Let me tell you what he said. He said if it wasn't us, it'd be somebody else. I guess maybe that's a good point. I don't know.
Yes, that's probably true. But I meant about this... all the sort of secret messages people seem to get in the dreams that, that we know them. And so it's so weird because we met one or two people on the trip. And I met one girl, I just tried to convince her, that she couldn't have had any sort of weird message or anything. It was funny, we were talking for hours about these messages she seemed to have thought she'd got. It was all like out of a science fiction book, I'm sure it wasn't true. Because I was supposed to know her, you see, according to her messages and according to her dreams. I was supposed to recognize her immediately and fall in love with her, which didn't happen, definitely didn't happen. So I just had to sort of tell her, that it was all wrong. Still, it's been a nice tour,
Thank you very much, everybody. Good evening.
We're talking with journalist Ivor Davis, who traveled with the Beatles on their 1964 summer tour of the U.S. His new book is called The Beatles and Me on Tour, and George Harrison said on the Beatles anthology, he said, the world used the Beatles as an excuse to go mad, which meant that they were more or less prisoners of their own fame.
They could never go anywhere. Most of the time they were trapped in the hotel, because there was they risked serious injury if they stepped outside, and so they were stuck, and they complained about that, but they realized that they couldn't go wandering around, and they were confined to their bedrooms almost. However, the other funny thing was that the young women were very inventive in finding ways to get to the Beatles. I mean, many a time I got to my hotel room on the same floor next door to the Beatles suite, and the three girls came bursting, and said, "Where are they? Where are they?" It's unimaginable, but it happened. And they hid in room service carts. They climbed up fire escapes. They got stuck in air conditioning vents. all in an effort to get up close and hold the Beatles' hands.
But I think we should point out, and I don't think this is anything that is salacious, but there were, in fact, girls around the Beatles' age that they could, what's the polite way of putting it, fraternize
they
with.
Connive with, or
right.
They could, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there were, and I must tell you that there was one early scare in Las Vegas about underage girls, and the Beatles and their road managers were very, very careful to make sure that the young women that came to visit and to get autographs and sing and dance and do whatever young women do with the Beatles, were of the right age. And very often, Miss Pocahontas or Miss Illinois or wherever we were would come along and have a picture taken with them. And sometimes the Beatles took a shine to them, and sometimes they didn't.
Right.
The Beatles and Brian, their manager, were very wary of people who were trying to capitalize on them. And at the same time, strangely enough, when they came into a new city, within an hour, the mayor or the mayor's wife or the mayor's best friend would show up and insist that they be taken to the Beatles' suite. Well, I mean, it was a nice idea, but the Beatles did not want to be exploited. And that actually happened in Hollywood, where the Beatles were very fussy about the movie stars and the people that wanted to come and see them, because it was a non-stop parade of famous and not so famous.
How would you describe Brian Epstein and how he handled that?
Well, Brian Epstein was, if you saw him, he was a very cool, elegant, imperious-looking fellow. He wasn't a kind of guy that you could get close to. He was the guy that, of course, turned from the greasy kids in Hamburg to the lovable mop tops. So he knew what he was doing from that point of view. But as an individual, he was a very tortured man. We didn't know that he was gay, but in those days, of course, homosexuality in England was dangerous if you practiced it, because you could get arrested, and people did get arrested. So Brian kept that very quiet, and as a result, he was their Beatles, but he was not a glad-hander. He stood in the background. He rebuked them if he saw them, putting their hands in their pockets or doing things that they shouldn't do on stage. So he was a shadowy figure, quite a nice guy when you got to know him, but he was hiding his own personal secrets and his own personal demons.
He gets a lot of criticism after the fact for some bad business deals that he made in terms of merchandising and royalties and that sort of thing. I always feel like we have to give him a pass in a lot of ways, because there was no way to predict what would happen. I mean, it was bigger than Elvis, bigger than Sinatra. He did the best he could, and when you think about it, he did a remarkable job, because things could have gone really wrong.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, you've just hit the nail on the head. Number one, don't forget, merchandising was in its infancy, and frankly, he didn't know a thing about it. He tried to get his lawyer to take it over. The lawyer said, I'm too busy handling more important things. They gave it to a bunch of guys who didn't also know what they were doing, but they managed to get Brian to sign an agreement which gave 90% of merchandising to them, and 10% to the Beatles. And then one day in New York, the head of merchandising gave Brian a check for $9,000, and Brian said, "How much of this is yours?" And he said, "No." He said, "That's your percentage." And Brian thought for a minute and said, "Oh my gosh, I have blundered," and he had. But and then they went to court, and they sort of straightened it out a bit. But the amazing thing is that today, almost, merchandising for the Beatles is huge. It's more gigantic than it ever was in the Beatle heyday, because they've got it together. And anything that comes out that's Beatle usually has the Apple slogan, the Apple trademark on it.
You've written a new book called The Beatles and Me on Tour. Now, Ivor, you were present for a monumental occasion in the Beatles' career, a summit meeting between Bob Dylan and the Beatles. And it was the first time that the Beatles had tried a certain illicit herbal substance. Now, you were there.
Yes. Well, let me tell you, until I jogged my memory, the stories that came out were that Bob Dylan showed up with his road manager at the Delmonico Hotel in New York. Now, I was there, and I do not recollect that he came to the Delmonico Hotel because, first of all, there were about 200 New York PD cops hanging around the hotel. They had security, they had detectives, and if you smoked pot in those days, you could get arrested. I mean, I did a story with Dame Margot Fontaine, the great ballerina, who got arrested for going to a pot party. My memory is this, that I saw Bob Dylan, this kind of scruffy-looking fellow who would raid a chicken coop, come into the hotel outside New York, a motel-y hotel, the Idlewild Airport Motel, and he went in there, and we sat outside, and he was in there for about 3 hours with the Beatles, and when they all came out, they were stoned. They were zonked, and Ringo was on his knees. So I'm changing the story because I saw what happened. Or at least I wasn't in there puffing the cigarettes, but I saw the way they were afterwards.
What made you decide, after all these years, to write this book?
Well, it was very interesting because, don't forget, I went on for 40-odd years without even thinking about it. I mean,
Right.
people said, wow, you traveled with the Beatles. I said, yeah, but I also did other movie stars, and I did this and that. And then all of a sudden I realized that, hey, maybe it's about time I pulled it all together. Now, I still, at my tender age, have a fairly good memory, but the other thing that helped was I was able at my newspaper to compile all my clippings and send them to me in America where I live. So I had that. I also spoke to a great guy called Art Schreiber, who was a radio guy for Westinghouse, who had a sensational memory. I also spoke to one or two other people who are still around in the south of France, in England, and photographers that were there, including a great guy called Harry Benson, who's a New York photographer, famous. And, you know, with that in my memory, I was able to kind of cobble it together. And it's amazing how short-term memory sometimes you lose as you get old memory you remember vividly.
Right. Yeah, I can remember what I did 40 years ago, but last week I couldn't tell you.
Exactly. Exactly.
Now, if someone were to be interested in getting this book, and hopefully after this interview they will be, where would they go to get it?
Well, thank you for asking. Well, first of all, you can go onto Amazon and punch in The Beatles and Me on Tour by Ivor Davis, or I have a website, should you want to hear more about me, which you probably don't, but it's www.ivordavisbeatles.com. So tune in to any of those places, get the book, and I hope you'll find it an amusing, good read, and it's been a great pleasure to remember with you.
And again, I want to thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us. The book is The Beatles and Me on Tour, and by Ivor Davis. I should spell that Ivor Davis. And thank you so much for coming on, sir.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.